Every year, 18 million people visit New Orleans. They walk down Bourbon Street with neon-lit hurricanes in their hands. They pose for photos in front of iron lace balconies. They call it the most unique city in America. Jazz pouring out of every doorway, the smell of beignets and gumbo, strangers dancing in the street during Mardi Gras. This is the image, the celebration, the party that never ends. But if you're standing on Royal Street right now, sipping your drink, smiling at the architecture, you need to know something. Between 1718 and 1860, this exact spot was part of the largest slave market in the United States. Not one of the largest. The largest. More than 135,000 human beings were bought and sold within a 6-block radius of where tourists now take selfies. The buildings you're admiring, the ones with the beautiful wrought iron and the romantic balconies, many of them were auction houses. The courtyards where you're having brunch were holding pens. The cobblestones under your feet were where families stood, chained together, waiting to be separated forever. In 1842, a 16-year-old named Silas was sold in a building that today operates as the Hotel Monteleone. His sale receipt still exists in the Louisiana State Archives. The document lists his age, his height, a note that he could read, which made him worth more, and the name of the man who bought him. $1,200. That building still stands. People sleep there. They wake up, order room service, leave 5-star reviews. No plaque on the wall mentions Silas. No marker explains that this luxury hotel was built on the foundation of a place where children were sold like livestock. Here's what makes this even more disturbing. The culture that New Orleans is famous for, the jazz, the food, the music that defines this city, it was created by the descendants of the very people who were sold on these streets. Congo Square, just a few blocks away, was the only place in America where enslaved Africans were allowed to gather and play music on Sundays. That's where jazz was born. The gumbo everyone loves. That's a West African recipe, preserved by cooks who had no choice but to work in the kitchens of the men who bought them. Mardi Gras, with its second lines and brass bands, that tradition comes directly from African funeral practices mixed with French Catholic ritual. New Orleans didn't just profit from slavery. The city was built by it, defined by it, shaped by it in ways that tourists never see, and history books barely mention. 50% of the wealth in this city, before the Civil War, came directly from the sale of human beings. The families who built the grand mansions, who established the banks, who created what we now call Old New Orleans money. They made their fortunes destroying other families, selling mothers away from their children, husbands away from their wives. And the name everyone knows, the French Quarter, that romantic term that appears on every postcard and every travel blog, it's a comfortable lie. It makes the area sound charming, European, historic, in a safe way. But what really happened in those streets wasn't charming. It was systematic. It was industrial. It was a machine designed to extract wealth from human suffering on a scale that most Americans have never been taught. So when you see those 18 million tourists walking around, celebrating, calling this place magical, remember that they're celebrating on top of a foundation that nobody wants to talk about. The paradise was built on bodies, and nobody put up a memorial. The reason there's no memorial, the reason 18 million people can walk these streets without knowing, is because the system was designed to be invisible. Not hidden, invisible. Woven so deeply into the fabric of the city that removing it would mean dismantling New Orleans itself. This wasn't just commerce happening on the side. This was the economy. This was the foundation. and the architecture of that horror is still standing. In 1724, the French colonial government established something called the Code Noir, the Black Code, a set of laws that regulated slavery in Louisiana. But here's what made New Orleans different from every other city in America. The Code Noir wasn't just about control, it was about commerce. It standardized the process. It created rules for how human beings could be bought, sold, transferred, and categorized. It turned suffering into paperwork, and that paperwork still exists. You can walk into the Louisiana Historical Society right now and read bills of sale, transfer documents, auction announcements printed in newspapers like they were advertising furniture. The physical locations are still here too. Royal Street, between Conti and St. Louis, that stretch was lined with auction houses. Exchange Alley, the narrow walkway that tourists now stroll through to get from one street to another, that was where private sales happened, where buyers inspected people before the public auctions. Chartres Street had the holding facilities, the places where newly arrived Africans and people sold from failing plantations were kept until auction day. These weren't back alleys or hidden warehouses. These were the main commercial streets, prime real estate, the center of the city's economic life. One of the most successful dealers was a man named Gideon Holloway. He operated out of a building that today houses a restaurant where you can order $30 entrees and sit on a patio under string lights. Between 1835 and 1857, Holloway sold an estimated 2,000 people. His records show he moved between 30 and 40 individuals every week during peak season, which ran from November through March, when plantation owners had cash from their harvests and needed more workers for the next planting cycle. He advertised in the Daily Picayune, the city's main newspaper. Prime field hands, excellent house servants, families available. Families available. That phrase shows up over and over in the ads. It sounds almost considerate until you realize what it actually meant. In 1839, a woman named Willa was brought to Holloway's facility with her 3 children. She had worked on a cotton plantation in Mississippi, but the owner died and the estate was being liquidated. Everything sold: the land, the equipment, the buildings, the people. Willa's sale receipt lists her as healthy, obedient, age approximately 32, and notes that she came with 3 children, ages 7, 9, and 11, 2 boys and 1 girl, all healthy. The document shows they were sold separately. One child went to a sugar plantation in St. Charles Parish. Another went to a rice plantation near Lake Pontchartrain. The third went to a buyer in Mobile, Alabama. Willa herself was purchased by a cotton broker and sent to Natchez. The entire family, people who had lived together, worked together, survived together, were scattered across 3 states in a single afternoon. The bill of sale for the youngest child, a 7-year-old boy, includes a note that he cried considerably during inspection, and the price was reduced by $50 because of it. This happened thousands of times. This wasn't an exception. This was the business model. The economy of New Orleans didn't just tolerate the destruction of families, it depended on it. Enslaved people who had family connections were considered risky because they might try to run, might resist, might cause trouble trying to reunite. Separating families wasn't cruelty for its own sake. Although it was cruel, it was economic strategy. Break the bonds, eliminate the resistance, maximize the profit. And here's what nobody talks about. The buildings that made this possible, the ones where Gideon Holloway and dozens of men like him conducted their business, they're the same buildings that are now protected as historic landmarks. The ironwork balconies that define the French Quarter aesthetic, many of them were forged by enslaved blacksmiths. The courtyards with the fountains and the tropical plants, Those were the holding areas. The charming, narrow streets. They were designed that way to make it easier to move groups of chained people from the docks to the markets without disrupting other traffic. The city's most famous architectural features, the things that make New Orleans unique and beautiful, are the remnants of a machine built to commodify human beings. By 1860, more than 50% of the city's wealth came directly from the slave trade. Not from cotton or sugar or shipping, although those industries depended on slavery too, but from the actual buying and selling of people. The commission fees, the auction house profits, the financing arrangements, the insurance policies. Yes, you could insure enslaved people like you'd insure cargo. All of it flowing through New Orleans because this city was the hub. If you wanted to buy large numbers of people, you came here. If you needed to liquidate an estate, you sent them here. If you were a speculator looking to profit from human misery, this was your market. The families that built New Orleans, the ones whose names are still on streets and buildings, they made their fortunes this way. And when the Civil War ended, when slavery was abolished, they didn't face trials, they didn't face reparations, they didn't even face social stigma. They kept their wealth, kept their property, kept their status. The only thing that changed was the paperwork. But the paperwork changing didn't mean the erasure stopped. It just took new forms. Because here's what happened after slavery ended in 1865. New Orleans didn't suddenly become a place where black communities could thrive. Instead, the city spent the next 150 years finding new ways to destroy them, displace them, erase them. And each time, it was deliberate. Each time, there was a choice. And each time, the city chose to forget. Let's start with Congo Square. Between 1817 and 1851, this was the only place in the entire United States where enslaved Africans were legally allowed to gather in public. Every Sunday afternoon, hundreds of people would come to this open space at the edge of the French Quarter to play music, dance, trade goods, speak their languages, maintain their traditions. For people who spent 6 days a week being treated as property, this was the one moment when they could be human. And out of those Sunday gatherings, out of the drums and the chants and the dances that mixed Bambara and Wolof and Yoruba traditions with French and Spanish and Caribbean influences, that's where jazz was born. Not in a concert hall, not in a recording studio, in a dusty square where people who had been stolen from their homes tried to remember who they were. There was a man named Thaddeus who played drums in Congo Square for over 30 years. He'd been brought to New Orleans from Senegal as a child, survived the Middle Passage, survived decades of forced labor, and every Sunday he would come to that square and play the same rhythms his father had taught him before he was taken. Other musicians started copying his patterns, mixing them with new sounds, creating something that had never existed before. Thaddeus didn't live to see jazz become famous. He didn't live to see Louis Armstrong or Jelly Roll Morton or any of the legends who built their careers on the foundation he helped create. But without those Sunday gatherings, without that space where African traditions could survive and evolve, jazz doesn't happen. The music that defines New Orleans, the music that defines American culture, it came directly from Congo Square. So what did the city do with this sacred space, this birthplace of American music? In 1851, city officials banned the gatherings. The official reason was concerns about public order. But the real reason was fear. Fear that if black people kept gathering, kept organizing, kept maintaining their own culture and community, they might resist. They might demand more. They might remind everyone that they were human beings, not tools. So the gatherings were outlawed, The space was absorbed into a city park, and for over 100 years, nobody talked about what had happened there. Today, Congo Square still exists. It's a nice park. There's a small plaque with 3 sentences about the Sunday gatherings. 3 sentences. For the birthplace of jazz, for the only place in America where African culture survived slavery intact. 3 sentences, and most tourists walk right past it without stopping. But that erasure, that's just the beginning. Let's move forward to 1897. That's when the city created Storyville, a 38-block district where prostitution was legal. The official story is that this was about regulation, about containing vice to one area. But here's what they don't tell you. The majority of the women working in Storyville were black and Creole, women who had been pushed into this work because after Reconstruction collapsed, there were almost no other options. Former enslaved people and their children had been promised land, education, opportunity. Instead, they got Jim Crow laws, segregation, economic exclusion. And for women, particularly women of color, the options were domestic work in white households or Storyville. One of those women was a 19-year-old named Opal. She could play piano, had taught herself by listening through windows of houses in the Garden District where wealthy white families had music lessons. But there were no music schools that would accept her, no concert halls that would hire her. The only place a young black woman could make money playing piano in New Orleans in 1900 was in the brothels of Storyville. So that's where she went. And she wasn't alone. The early jazz legends, the ones who became famous later, Jelly Roll Morton, Sidney Bechet, King Oliver, they all got their start playing in Storyville because it was the only place that would pay black musicians. The music that would eventually make New Orleans world famous was being created in brothels by people who had no other choice. Then, in 1917, the U.S. Navy demanded that Storyville be shut down. They didn't want their sailors exposed to vice, so the city closed it. Overnight, no warning, no transition plan, no support for the thousands of women who worked there. The buildings were demolished or converted. The women were told to find other work, but there was no other work, so most ended up arrested for prostitution in other parts of the city, the same prostitution that had been legal a week before. And here's the part that should disturb you. In the 1950s, city officials deliberately destroyed most of the remaining photographs and documents from Storyville. Not because they were ashamed of the prostitution, but because they didn't want evidence of how central black musicians and black culture had been to that era. They wanted to erase the origins. They wanted to tell a different story about where jazz came from, one that didn't involve black women and men surviving in the margins. But the most brutal erasure, the one that proves this was never about the past, it was always about the present, that happened in Trem. This neighborhood, established in 1789, is the oldest black neighborhood in the United States. For generations, it was a thriving community. Musicians, families, churches, businesses. The culture that makes New Orleans famous, it came from Trem. The second lines, the brass bands, the street celebrations, that's Trem tradition. But in 1968, city and state officials decided to build Interstate 10, a massive elevated highway that would cut through the heart of New Orleans. They had options for where to route this highway. They could have run it 3 blocks north, through a wealthier, whiter neighborhood. But that would have meant demolishing expensive properties, displacing influential families, facing resistance from people with lawyers and political connections. So instead, they chose Trem. They chose to cut the oldest black neighborhood in America in half, with a concrete overpass that would bring noise, pollution, and destruction. A woman named Lorraine Davis, who was 67 years old in 1968, watched as bulldozers tore down her street. 326 homes were demolished. Families that had lived in those houses for 3-4 generations were given 30 days to relocate. No equivalent housing was offered. No compensation that matched the property value. Just eviction notices and bulldozers. Lorraine's daughter, a woman named Trina, was 31 when they lost their home. She'd grown up on that street, raised her own children there, worked as a seamstress in a shop 2 blocks away. After the highway came through, the shop closed. The school her kids attended closed. The church where her family had been members for 5 generations was demolished. Trina moved to a rental apartment in a different neighborhood, paid twice as much for half the space, and watched as Trem, the community that had survived slavery and Jim Crow and the Depression, was ripped apart by a highway that didn't need to go there. Today, Treme still exists, but it's 70% smaller than it was. Property values never recovered. The community never reunited. And Trina, like thousands of others, never got to go home. This is the pattern. Congo Square, banned and forgotten. Storyville, demolished and erased. Trem, cut in half and displaced. 3 different eras, 3 different methods, but the same result. Every time a black community in New Orleans built something, created something, established something, the city found a way to destroy it. And every time, they called it something else. Progress, development, public safety. But it was always the same thing. Erasure. And that pattern, that cycle of erasure, it didn't stop in the 20th century. It continued. It evolved. And in 2005, the world got to see exactly how far it would go. Because when the water came, when Hurricane Katrina flooded New Orleans and the levees failed and the city drowned, what happened next wasn't a natural disaster. It was a choice, a continuation of the same choice the city had been making for 300 years. But let's go back for a moment. Back to 1965. Hurricane Betsy hit New Orleans that September, and the lower Ninth Ward, a predominantly black neighborhood, flooded completely. Thousands of families lost everything. A man named Vernon, who worked at the port unloading ships, came home to find his house filled with 8 feet of water. Everything he owned, gone. His wife's family photos, his children's clothes, the furniture they'd spent 20 years paying off, all of it destroyed. And here's what people who lived through Betsy will tell you. Even today, even 60 years later, they swear they heard explosions. They swear they saw city workers near the levees right before the lower Ninth Ward flooded. They swear the levees were deliberately blown to save wealthier, whiter neighborhoods. The official investigation said no, said there was no evidence of dynamite, no proof of sabotage, just a storm and old infrastructure. But here's what the investigation never explained. Why did the lower Ninth Ward flood first? Why did the water hit that neighborhood harder than anywhere else? Why were there reports of explosions that dozens of witnesses confirmed, but no official record acknowledged? And most importantly, why did the government promise to fix the levees, promise to protect these neighborhoods, and then do nothing for 40 years? Vernon lived long enough to see Katrina. He was 86 years old when the water came again in 2005. And this time, he didn't survive. Hurricane Katrina hit on August 29, 2005. The storm itself was devastating, but the real catastrophe came after, when the levee system failed and 80% of the city flooded. 1,833 people perished. More than half of them were black residents from the poorest neighborhoods. Not because they chose to stay, not because they ignored warnings, but because they had no way to leave. No cars, no money for hotels, no relatives in other states who could take them in. The evacuation plan assumed everyone had resources. It assumed everyone had options. And for hundreds of thousands of people, that assumption was wrong. In the lower Ninth Ward, a 73-year-old man named Marshall Thompson spent 4 days on his roof. He watched the water rise. He watched helicopters fly overhead. He waved his arms. He shouted. He hung a white sheet from his chimney as a signal. The helicopters kept flying. They'd circle, someone inside would look down, and then they'd fly away. 4 days. In the sun, in the rain, without food, without water, watching his neighbors' houses sink, hearing people calling for help from other rooftops, and the helicopters just kept flying past. When Marshall was finally rescued, he asked the volunteer boat crew why it took so long. They told him they weren't allowed into certain neighborhoods at first. Weren't allowed. There were rules about where rescue teams could go and when. And the black neighborhoods, the poor neighborhoods, they weren't priority zones. Later, when documents were released through Freedom of Information requests, emails between city and state officials revealed something that most people still don't know. There were discussions during the crisis about which neighborhoods to rescue first. There were debates about resources, about priorities, about strategic decisions. And in one email, buried in hundreds of pages of correspondence, a federal official wrote this about the reconstruction planning. This is an opportunity to change the demographics. We can make New Orleans smaller and whiter. We shouldn't waste this chance. That email is real. It's in the public record, and it tells you everything you need to know about what happened next. Because the reconstruction of New Orleans wasn't equal. It wasn't fair. It wasn't even trying to be. The French Quarter, the tourist areas, the places where the money flows, they were rebuilt in 18 months. Power restored, buildings repaired, businesses reopened. Walk through the French Quarter today, and you'd barely know Katrina happened. But the lower Ninth Ward, 20 years later, still has entire blocks of empty lots. Houses that were never demolished, just left to rot. Families who wanted to come back, but were told they couldn't, were told the city had new zoning requirements, were told their neighborhood was being reimagined. A woman named Pearl owned a house in the lower Ninth Ward. Her family had lived there since 1947. She'd raised 4 children in that house, buried her husband from the church down the street, watched her grandchildren play in the yard. When Katrina flooded the neighborhood, Pearl evacuated to Houston. She stayed with her daughter Trina, waited for the water to recede, and then tried to come home. The house was damaged but standing. The foundation was solid. Pearl had insurance. She had the will to rebuild. What she didn't have was permission. The city denied her building permit, said the lot didn't meet new elevation requirements, said the neighborhood was being rezoned, said she could sell the land to the city for a fraction of its value, or she could let it sit empty, but she couldn't rebuild. Pearl fought for 3 years, hired a lawyer she couldn't afford, filed appeals, attended city council meetings where officials talked about urban renewal and smart growth and sustainable development. All of those words meant the same thing. They meant black people weren't coming back. In 2005, before Katrina, the lower Ninth Ward had a population of 14,000, almost all black. Today, it has 4,000 residents. The rest are gone, displaced to Houston, to Atlanta, to cities across the country where they had to start over with nothing. And in their place, on the land where their houses stood, there are new developments, condominiums, coffee shops, art galleries. the kind of neighborhood that real estate agents call up and coming, which is just another way of saying, we got rid of the people who used to live here. Trina never went back. Her mother, Pearl, passed away in Houston in 2012, still fighting for the right to rebuild, still holding on to the deed to a house she was never allowed to return to. Trina still has that deed. She keeps it in a box with her mother's photos, a reminder that they owned something once, that they belonged somewhere once, before the water came and the city decided they didn't fit the new plan. And here's what Katrina proved. The erasure never stopped. It just waited for the right moment. It waited for a disaster that could be blamed on nature, even though the failure of the levees was human, even though the decision about who to rescue first was human, even though the choice to prevent people from rebuilding was human. The city had been trying to erase these communities for 300 years. Katrina just gave them the excuse to finish the job. So now we circle back to where we started. 18 million tourists every year. Bourbon Street packed with people holding drinks. Jazz pouring out of clubs. Restaurants serving $25 bowls of gumbo. Mardi Gras parades with brass bands and dancing. This is what New Orleans sells. This is the brand. The Party City. The most unique place in America. And every single element of that brand, every tradition, every sound, every flavor, it was created by the descendants of the people this city spent 300 years trying to erase. Jazz didn't come from the French. It didn't come from the Spanish colonizers, or the wealthy Creole families, or the European immigrants who get mentioned in most history books. It came from Congo Square, from those Sunday gatherings where enslaved Africans kept their traditions alive. It came from Storyville, from young musicians like Opal playing piano in brothels, because it was the only place they were allowed to perform. It came from Trem, from the second lines and brass bands that grew out of African funeral traditions. The music that makes this city famous, the music that brings those 18 million tourists here, it was born in spaces that the city tried to destroy and created by people the city tried to forget. The same with the food. Gumbo, jambalaya, red beans and rice, all of those dishes that appear on every menu in the French Quarter, they're West African recipes adapted by cooks who had no choice about where they worked or who they worked for. The techniques, the ingredients, the way the flavors are built, that's not French cuisine. That's African tradition preserved through generations of cooks who kept their culture alive in the only place they had access to, the kitchens. And now you can buy a bowl of gumbo in a restaurant built on the foundation of a slave auction house, served by waiters who have no idea what happened in that building, to tourists who think they're experiencing authentic New Orleans cuisine without knowing whose authenticity they're consuming. Even Mardi Gras, the festival that defines this city, the celebration that brings in over $1 billion in tourism revenue every year, it's built on traditions that came from the communities the city displaced. The second lines, the brass bands, the way the music moves through the streets, that comes from Trem. The costumes, the masks, the way celebration mixes with ritual, that comes from the African and Caribbean practices that were maintained in places like Congo Square. But the modern Mardi Gras is controlled by crews, private social clubs that were historically white and exclusive, that didn't allow black members until the late 20th century, that still operate with very little diversity in their leadership. The culture was created by Black New Orleans. The profit goes somewhere else. And the physical evidence of this 300-year pattern, what actually remains, it tells you everything. The iron balconies on Royal Street, many of them forged by enslaved blacksmiths, they're still there, still holding up hotel balconies where people pose for photos. The buildings where Gideon Holloway and others like him sold thousands of human beings, they're still standing. Luxury hotels, high-end restaurants, art galleries. Not a single one has a plaque explaining what happened inside. Not one. The courtyard where Silas was sold, where Willa lost her children, where families were torn apart every week for decades, it's a boutique hotel now. You can book a room online. You can have cocktails in the space where people were held before auction. The tourists drinking there have no idea. Congo Square still exists, yes, but the plaque is so small and so understated that thousands of people walk past it every day without stopping. 3 sentences about the birthplace of jazz. 3 sentences about the only place in America where African culture survived slavery intact. That's the memorial. Meanwhile, there are statues and monuments to Confederate generals, to plantation owners, to the men who built their fortunes on forced labor, scattered throughout the city. Those get plaques. Those get maintenance. Those get protected as historic landmarks. Storyville was completely demolished. There's not even a marker. The neighborhood where jazz legends got their start, where the sound that would define American music was refined and developed, it's gone, erased so thoroughly that you'd need a historian with old maps to even tell you where it was. And Trim, the oldest black neighborhood in America, the community that survived slavery and Jim Crow and the Depression, it's still there but 70% smaller, still cut in half by a highway that didn't need to go through there, still struggling to recover from deliberate decisions that destroyed its foundation. The lower Ninth Ward, 20 years after Katrina, still has blocks of empty lots. Houses that families owned for generations, that they want to rebuild, that they have the deeds to, just sitting there, empty. While 3 blocks away, new developments are going up. Coffee shops and yoga studios and condos that cost $500,000 in a neighborhood where the median income used to be $30,000 a year. That's not recovery. That's replacement. And it's the same pattern that's been playing out since 1718. Destroy the community. Erase the evidence. Profit from what remains. So when you see those 18 million tourists walking around New Orleans, taking photos, celebrating, calling it magical, understand what they're really seeing. They're seeing the mask. They're seeing the version of the city that's been carefully constructed to hide everything underneath. They're drinking on streets where humans were sold. They're dancing to music created by people who weren't allowed to dance in those streets. They're eating food developed by cooks who couldn't eat in those restaurants. And they're doing it without knowing, because nobody put up a memorial. Nobody changed the narrative. Nobody decided that the truth was more important than the tourism dollars. There's a quote from a descendant of Lorraine Davis, the woman who lost her home when the highway cut through Trem. He said this in an interview in 2022. They sold our ancestors. Then they sold our houses. Now they sell our culture. And they never apologized for any of it. That's the reality. New Orleans built an economy on human suffering, spent 3 centuries erasing the evidence, and now profits from the culture created by the survivors. The jazz, the food, the celebration, it's all real. It's all authentic. But it was never theirs. It belongs to the people this city tried to forget. So next time you're in New Orleans, standing on Royal Street with a hurricane in your hand, listening to a brass band play, remember, you're standing where Silas was sold, where Willa lost her children, where Thaddeus played drums to keep his culture alive, where Opal played piano because she had no other choice, where Lorraine watched her neighborhood get destroyed, where Vernon and Marshall and Pearl and Trina and thousands of others lost everything multiple times across multiple generations, and were told each time that it was necessary, that it was progress, that it was just how things had to be. The city is built on their foundations. The culture comes from their survival. And there's still no memorial.